God is so sovereign that he can even use human rebellion as a tool to accomplish his purposes. Well, as we continue our verse-by-verse journey through the whole Bible, we come to Genesis chapter 42. And throughout this section of Genesis, we've been using this visual timeline of Joseph's life to just track his journey so we know where we're at. And we've watched him endure these dark valleys and deep pits and seemingly impossible obstacles that looked like barriers to God's calling on his life. Yet by the time we get to Genesis chapter 41, Joseph, he's been lifted out of the prison dungeon and he's become the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. Well, every obstacle that appeared to stand in the way of God's calling on Joseph's life actually just became a stepping stone to fulfill the dreams that God gave to Joseph when he was just 17 years old. But as we hinted at last week, there's still one final obstacle that remains. And we've pictured this obstacle as a huge, mighty river that's wide and deep and wild and seemingly impossible to cross. Well, that obstacle is Joseph's family. It's this broken family that we've been studying the second half of the book of Genesis, especially these brothers who betrayed him. First plotting his murder and then selling him into slavery. And our obstacle here is not some gentle mountain stream. I mean, family wounds, they're rarely gentle. It's more like this, the Congo River, the deepest river on earth. It's 700 feet deep through much of the river, and it produces the most powerful rapids on earth. Their current, it's fierce, and the waters are turbulent, and crossing the Congo River at these rapids, it's impossible. I mean, this family, it's impossible. And maybe you can relate to that. Maybe your family seems impossible. Old wounds that go back decades. Maybe there's stubbornness and bitterness and wounds and words that were said that can never be taken back. Heated arguments or political divisions, betrayals, painful memories that seem to resurface every time that you're together. Well, family relationships, they can be deep, raging rapids, a river that feels, that guy was going really fast, a river that feels impossible to cross. Well, that's why Genesis 42 is so relevant to our lives, because as this story unfolds, well, we're going to watch God begin building a bridge across this chasm of a broken family relationship. And he does it in a surprising way, where God's primary bridge building material, the primary tool he uses to build bridges and families, it's never comfort. It's always crisis. When everything is going well, people rarely change or seek out broken relationships in their families. They stay entrenched in old habits, old bitterness and hurts and old patterns. But suddenly when crisis comes to a family, it has a way of melting hearts, humbling pride, and forcing people to confront relationships they've been avoiding for years. And that's exactly what's about to happen in Joseph's family. God, he's going to use a crisis, famine, to accomplish something greater than feeding hungry people. He's going to use crisis to begin healing a family that's been broken and divided for over 20 years. Because that's what God does. Is God builds relational bridges through crisis. Well, since we're talking about family skeletons and deep divisions, let's see how God begins to bridge that gap. So let's pick it up where we left off in Genesis chapter 41, just the last couple verses there. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. Chapter 42. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." Well, it doesn't exactly sound like a Hallmark Channel family reunion. I mean, first of all, they're in the middle of a famine. And notice something interesting. God, he warned a pagan king. He warned Pharaoh about the famine. But he never warned Jacob. I mean, this is the same Jacob. We studied his life. We learned he encountered God 8 different times in his lifetime. Yet, when this crisis arrives, there's no warning for Jacob. There's no dream. There's no special revelation. Just silence. Why? Well, because we've learned throughout Genesis that God is often more concerned with accomplishing his purposes than with making us happy or comfortable. So Jacob looks at his sons and asks a strange question. Why do you guys keep just looking at each other? Get off your rear ends is what he's saying. Well, why all the awkward silence? Because of the mention of Egypt, immediately it stirs up memories that these brothers have spent 20 years trying to bury Egypt. They know. That's where the caravan that they sold Joseph to was heading. Egypt, that's where their secret lived. That's where the biggest skeleton in their closet they had. That's where it exists. Egypt was where their guilt pointed. Can you imagine the shame at this moment? The weight on their consciences? The looks that they exchanged with each other? Well, meanwhile, the food, it's running out. Genesis 45, it tells us this unfolds within just the first 2 years of the 7-year famine. And well, suddenly their wealth, all the wealth that he had built, couldn't feed them. Their possessions couldn't save them. This family is staring at a full-blown crisis. And that's exactly where God begins his work. Because remember, God, he often builds relational bridges in families through crises. When people refuse to deal with old wounds voluntarily, God sometimes allows circumstances that force them to confront what they've been avoiding. Well, verse 3, then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. Well, we know what Jacob has been doing for almost 20 years. He's been grieving. Ever since he was handed Joseph, his favorite son's blood-stained robe, Jacob has lived as though his son was dead. 20 years of sorrow, 20 years of loss that just burned, 20 years of carrying a wound that never seems to heal. But while Jacob has been grieving, his sons, they've been hiding the truth. Jacob, he's trapped in sorrow. His sons, they're trapped in guilt. And now God is about to use this famine to bring all of them face to face with the truth that they've been avoiding for 2 decades. Because before God can heal a family, he often has to expose what has been buried beneath the surface. What's tragic is that this is not the Jacob that we once knew. This is the man who wrestled with God face to face and was transformed by him. And here we find him just consumed by loss and fear and grief. Instead of resting in God's promises, he's fixated on what he might lose next. He's afraid. I mean, that's why he's so overprotective of Benjamin, who by this time is probably a grown man. Well, fear has narrowed Jacob's vision until he can no longer see God's hand at work. If only he could see what God is doing behind the scenes. He can't see that every painful event, even his son disappearing and thought of as dead, it's all been woven into God's greater plan. He can't see that the only reason there's grain in Egypt to save his family is because God allowed his son to be taken away from him. But that's often how the sovereignty of God works. We rarely understand it in the moment. And that's one of the hidden gifts of crisis. It moves us to where comfort never would. Because under normal circumstances, these brothers would have never gone to Egypt. I mean, too many memories, too much guilt, too much shame. But need and crisis drove them there. And that's what God does. He'll use crisis in a family to get that family to where it needs to be, moving towards the very place where healing and restoration and reconciliation are found, and waiting. Well, verse 5. So, Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was a famine in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold the grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Well, woo, that should jump off the page if you've been with us throughout this entire study. Because just think about those dreams back when Joseph was 17 years old. For more than 20 years, they appeared distant, delayed, impossible even. Maybe just to be taken symbolically or as an allegory. Yeah, I mean, Joseph, he'd become the ruler in Egypt. But that's not what the dreams were ultimately about. The dreams involved his brothers and his family bowing down before him. Well, then, in that single moment, 20 years later, unexpectedly, everything changed. His brothers, they walk in the room, and the first thing they do is bow down with their faces to the ground. Just exactly like the dreams that God had given him so many years earlier. They were fulfilled specifically, literally, and exactly as God has said. Here's what's remarkable. Without the famine, this moment never happens. Without the crisis, the brothers, they never leave Canaan. Without the hunger, they never come to Egypt. Without the pain, there's no fulfillment. The very circumstances that seemed so devastating were the very means by which God accomplished his plan. The irony, it's breathtaking. When Joseph's brothers, when they plotted to kill him and instead sold him into slavery, they did so with one goal in mind. They wanted to stop his dreams from ever happening. But what they failed to understand, something about God's sovereignty. The very act that they intended to use to stop it were God's way, the vehicle that God used to accomplish it. By sending Joseph to Egypt, they unknowingly set into motion the events that would fulfill the very dreams they're trying to prevent. Well, that's just how big God is. People can oppose his plans. They can delay his plans. They can fight against his plans and his will. But in the end, they can't stop God. God is so sovereign that he can even use human rebellion as a tool to accomplish his purposes. Well, verse 7. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. Well, we'll learn later that Joseph is actually using an interpreter. So his brothers have no idea who they're standing before, especially with their faces to the ground. And can you imagine what's going through Joseph's mind? I mean, for over 20 years, he's carried the memory of their betrayal. And now, the very brothers who sold him into slavery are bowing down at his feet, at his mercy. Well, is Joseph going to let them have it? I mean, it reminds me of Maximus in Gladiator. You know, he's betrayed, stripped of everything, sold into slavery. And when Maximus, when he finally faces the man who ruined his life, he takes revenge. And we cheer it because it completely feels justified. Well, Joseph, he has the same opportunity. I mean, with the snap of his fingers, they're done. Egyptian guards would come and drag these brothers away and put them on poles just like the baker. He has the power. He has the authority. And no one would blame him if he did it. But he doesn't. Why? Because Joseph is finally beginning to understand the dreams. They're not about revenge. They're about rescue. God didn't bring Joseph to Egypt to destroy his family. God just sent Joseph ahead of them in order to save them all. So instead of reacting in anger or reacting in emotion, Joseph, he responds wisely. And what happens next, it reveals that reconciliation, it requires more than forgiveness. It requires transformation. And Joseph needs to know whether these are the same brothers who sold him into slavery, or whether God has worked in them and even changed their hearts. Verse 8, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. It's important to know here that Joseph, he's not playing games with his brothers. He's probably tempted to reveal himself right there on the spot. But when God brings the dreams back to mind, Joseph responds with wisdom instead of emotion. He doesn't rush. He's very careful here with his heart. He understands that true reconciliation, it requires more than a tearful reunion. Before he entrusts himself to these men again, he needs to know whether they've changed. Is there any humility in their hearts? Any regret over what they did? Any evidence that God has been working in them the same way that God has been working in him? So Joseph, he moves slowly, wisely, and deliberately, not to punish his brothers, but instead to discover whether repentance has had the chance to take root. Verse 10, no, my lord, they answered. Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. Well, of course, Joseph knows they're not spies. But he also knows they're not honest men. And they come from a family we've studied in Genesis. A long line of deceivers, just like their father Jacob, the heel catcher. So Joseph tests them. Verse 12. No, he said to them, you have come here to see where our land is unprotected. But they replied, your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. Whew. Joseph knows that last one isn't true. He's not no more. He's not dead. He's standing right in front of them, listening to every word that they're speaking. The very brother that they claimed was gone was the one that they're bowing before. In fact, I suspect the brothers had repeated this lie so many times that they had almost come to a belief in it themselves, that he's just dead. Perhaps part of them even hoped that Joseph was dead. It would have been easier than living with the guilt of what they had actually done. But don't miss the bombshell report. For the first time, Joseph learns that Benjamin is alive and well. His baby brother, the one other son of Rachel besides himself, the one person in the family who had nothing to do with his betrayal. Benjamin is alive, and although he's still back home with their father Jacob, that piece of information kind of changes everything. I mean, suddenly, this isn't just about the past. It's about the possibility of a future. And it's about whether Joseph might one day be reunited with the baby brother he hasn't seen in more than 20 years. Not really a baby anymore. And this test, it's no longer just theoretical. Now it's personal. Well, verse 14. Joseph said to them, it is just as I've told you. You are spies, and this is how you'll be tested. As surely as the Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. And he put them all in custody for 3 days. Probably in the very dungeon where Joseph himself had spent all those years. And when the brothers sit in confinement, just imagine the thoughts running through Joseph's mind. What happened to Benjamin after I was gone? Did they treat him the way that they mistreated me? Have they abused him and resented him, targeted him because he was Rachel's other son? And if Benjamin comes to Egypt, will he be safe with them? Joseph doesn't know the answers because he doesn't know their hearts. That's why he moves extremely carefully here. He wants to walk in wisdom rather than stumble into the trap of misplaced trust. Well, this is an important distinction. You know, God, He calls us to forgive those who have wronged us, and we do that. But forgiveness and trust, they're not the same thing. Forgiveness, you can give freely, but trust must be rebuilt. Trust, it's earned over time through consistent character, honesty, and repentance. Well, Joseph, finally, he's going to discover if his brothers have really changed at all. Verse 18. On the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. Did you just catch what the Prime Minister of Egypt just said? I fear God? Joseph, he almost tips his hand there. In the middle of the interrogation, he reveals that he fears the one true God. the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You'd think that would comfort his brothers. It does the opposite effect. It terrifies them. Why? Because of their guilty conscience. Guilty conscience doesn't find comfort in God until it surrenders. And now, the most powerful man in Egypt is talking about fearing God. Suddenly, this feels like a lot more than a grain transaction. It feels like God is involved. That's exactly what's happening. They're right. The God that they thought they'd escaped from all along had been pursuing them. Verse 19. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified, that you may not die. This they proceeded to do. Again, after 3 days. Boy, that seems to be an important number in the Bible. After 3 days, Joseph, he changes his strategy. Instead of keeping 9 brothers and sending one home, he sends 9 home and keeps 1 brother in prison. Why? Because he's testing them. Will they abandon another brother and return home with another lie for their father? Or will they keep their word, bring Benjamin back, and rescue their brother that's been left behind? I mean, Joseph, he's intentionally recreated a situation that mirrors their mistake from the past. Have they changed? Well, reluctantly, they agree. But they know their father. And they know their father will never want Benjamin to go. Then they begin talking amongst themselves in Hebrew, assuming that this Egyptian can't understand them. But they're wrong. They're dead wrong. Joseph understands every word. Well, verse 21, they said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us. Well, for the first time, we learned what really happened that day. Joseph, he wasn't silent when they threw him in a pit in the cistern. His brothers, if you remember, they sat down and ate lunch while their brother was begging for mercy. He pleaded for his life. He cried out for help. And they just ate lunch and ignored him. No wonder this moment comes rushing back. For more than 20 years, the sound of their little brother's voice had haunted them. And now, standing in Egypt, they finally connect the dots. This distress has come upon us because of what we did to Joseph. But they're completely misunderstanding what God is doing. They think God is punishing them. In reality, God is restoring them. Listen, that's how we often view our past. And then when it comes out in crisis, we assume that God is against us. Well, he may be in those moments actually using the crisis to bring us to repentance. And repentance is the key to reconciliation and restoration in our family relationships. The famine, it wasn't punishment. It was God building a bridge home. Verse 22, Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an account for his blood. They did not realize that Joseph could understand them since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them. Oh, can you catch his heart? I mean, just imagine the grief and the pain and the scars that Joseph had been carrying for over 20 years. I mean, the pit, the slavery, the prison. But for the first time, Joseph, he gets a glimpse into his brothers' hearts. For the first time, he hears their grief, their guilt, and their remorse. And it overwhelms him, and you can imagine why. Because the wounds like this, they never go away. They're still fresh. They're still real. But so is the evidence here that God has been at work in their lives. That's why Joseph, what he hears and the emotion he experiences, it brings him to tears. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. So the bridge here, it's being built. But there can be no quick, hey, Joseph, sorry about trying to kill you, and then move on. These wounds, they're too deep. The betrayal, it was too great. Again, trust takes time to rebuild, and that's why Joseph doesn't rush the process. Reconciliation may begin with repentance, but trust is restored through proven character over time. And often, it's walking through a crisis together that God uses as a gift to rebuild trust that once was lost. God isn't just bringing this family back together. He's rebuilding it from the ground up. Verse 25. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkey and left. You just can't help but see Joseph's character here. And you can see his heart for his family. You see his love for his brothers. I mean, these are the men who cursed him, betrayed him, sold him, but to bless them. But Joseph's desire is not to punish them or for revenge. It's to bless them. He secretly puts their money back into their sacks. He's providing for them, and he's blessing them on their journey. He doesn't stop there. He even supplies them for their journey home. What a picture of grace. The brothers, they deserve judgment, but Joseph responds with generosity. They expect punishment, but they receive provision. Does that sound familiar? We haven't talked about this, but Joseph, he's a type or a prophetic picture of Jesus Christ. And this is just a beautiful glimpse into how God treats us. Well, verse 27. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw his silver in the mouth of his sack. "My silver has been returned," he said to his brothers. "Here it is in my sack." Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" Can you see how this is a test of their hearts? Not just from Joseph, but from God. How will they respond with the money? Their hearts are filled with shame, and we know that. And shame has made its way into twisting everything. It makes us fearful and defensive and self-focused. Instead of seeing what God is doing, we assume the worst. We go to the worst case scenarios. We begin interpreting acts of kindness as threats and gifts as punishment. Well, that's exactly what's happening here. Their consciences, they're heavy. And they're in such heavy bondage that they can't even receive a blessing as a blessing. They immediately assume that it's God punishing them, that God's against them. But God is not against them, far from it. God, He's pursuing them. His bridge of restoration is being built. The crisis, it's not over. And next week, we'll see the wonder of God on full display as He continues to work, not only restoring brothers, but restoring the heart of a father that's been trapped in grief, fear, and bitterness. As we close, I want to remind us of something. Family relationships, they're just hard, and so is crisis. But isn't it amazing that God can take the very things that we dread the most and turn them into instruments of grace? That He can transform crisis into good and mourning into joy. Only God can do that. Only God can take a cancer diagnosis and use that to reconcile a son with his father. Only God can use a bankruptcy to save a marriage. Only God can take the tragedy of losing a child and draw an entire family into a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. That's what God does. He builds bridges where we only see impossible divides. So instead of dreading every crisis and dreading every family reunion, learn to lean into God in the middle of both. Because even when we can't see His hand, He's still at work. And sometimes the very crisis we're asking God to remove is the tool He's using to answer the prayers that we've been praying for decades.